All right, I need a haircut. That's what it looks like there. Okay. All right, so this was the last slide from on Tuesday, right? So on Tuesday we were talking, and when I say we, right, it's mainly me talking, but I want to include you in experience, so I'll say we. All right, we were talking about how the kind of the some of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, like things like each state had their own currency. We didn't have a strong kind of like central government. There was no executive branch. All right. There was kind of an issue in the sense where like taxation was not required for states to send to the kind of like to the national government. All right. And then that incident called Shays Rebellion over the issues of taxation within Massachusetts kind of highlighted that we probably need to kind of revise this. So they met, some of the delegates of about 5 of the states met in Maryland and Annapolis at a tavern to kind of maybe talk about, hey, let's kind of fix things like, tariffs and stuff like that. So that led to the kind of Constitutional Convention, which was in kind of May into September of 1787. Do you guys remember Bailey, what's up, huh? I just posted them. It says section 2, but it should be section 3. So should be Foundations of Government, section 2, section 3, part 2, a new constitution. Now this honey, this is the last slide from the other day. Usually when I'm in the middle here, I'm just going to kind of start with kind of what we started last and just do a little kind of review, a little synopsis. All right. So maybe a question on the test. In what city was the Constitutional Convention held? They call it the City of Brotherly Love. They got a big bell there. It's got a big crack in it.
It's Liberty Bell.
What's that?
Liberty Bell, I know that.
Yeah, it's the Liberty Bell. They held it in Independence Hall.
New York?
Not New York, a little bit south of New York. It's in Pennsylvania. All right. Philadelphia. Boom. That might be a question on the test. So know that the Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia. All right. So the kind of of the 13 states, 12 of the states sent delegates. Do you remember what state didn't send? Rhode Island, the smallest state. Rhode Island felt that the Articles of Confederation worked just fine. What's that?
You can walk across it in a day.
Right. Yeah. Literally, I've done that before. Yeah. It's like, oh, we just came through Rhode Island. Look at that. And so, yeah. And so they met with the idea of just revising the Articles of Confederation, but what ends up happening is they decided to scrap it. All right. And they did this in relative secret because they didn't want to cause a panic, right? This idea that, the fear that that people may find out and like people that have lost faith in government, if you will. So what ends up happening is they work out, there are certain things like they decide to have an executive branch, a judicial branch, which we'll talk about, like kind of like separation of powers and all this other concept here, 3-branch government and stuff. All right, but the big issue was over kind of representation in Congress. All right, and like how mainly between large states in population and small states in population. All right, so you had to cut like large states. Their plan was referred to as the Virginia Plan, named after the guy who presented it, Edmund Randolph, was a Virginia delegate, who was the governor of Virginia at the time. They advocated for basically kind of like a 2-house legislature, both based on population, meaning the larger your population, the more representatives you have. The New Jersey plan was a small state one, which basically said, let's just have a unicameral legislature, meaning 1 house. Everybody gets equal representation, meaning they were going to send 1 delegate. All right, so no matter what your population size, everybody had the same say. That was almost kind of basically, the convention was almost going to fall apart as a result of that. All right. There was another plan thrown in by Alexander Hamilton, which kind of advocated almost for like a monarch, to a certain extent, and certain delegates like elected for life. That seemed a little too much like kind of what we had just kind of left. So they preferred that as a British plan. Didn't get a whole lot of traction. All right. The New Jersey and Virginia plans essentially kind of came together, if you will. They took what we call a compromise, right? And that's what we got was the Connecticut plan, named after the delegate Roger Sherman, who's a delegate from Connecticut. They referred to this as the Great Compromise. So what we got is essentially what we have primarily now in our legislature: bicameral, meaning 2 houses. That's a concept that we did get from kind of from the British Parliament. All right. The lower house based on population. That's what we have as a House of Representatives right now. All right. And then how do we determine a state's population and essentially a country's population? Census, right? And this year's the census. So and essentially the larger population, more population, you get more delegates to the House of Representatives, more representatives. The upper house, based on equal representation, that's what we have as the Senate, right? So today, in the Senate, we have two states. Every state gets 2 senators. All right. So this seemed like, okay, this kind of basically kind of staved off the convention falling apart. Now, another issue was also based on the idea, how do we count people towards population, was related to the fact that we see a difference in kind of economics between northern states and southern states. All right. Southern states, you see larger kind of tracts of farmland that we know as plantations, right? Right. And much of that with the cash crop of cotton required essentially free labor. And the cheapest labor in world history is slave labor. All right. So there was an issue on how do we count slaves towards this issue here? Because we have a problem here, because slaves aren't at this time considered to be citizens. All right. This is something that we're still dealing with today. People are the ramifications of this is why history is important. A lot of people get bored with history, but history casts a long shadow. All right. This country has been dealing with the issue of race probably even before this, but a main kind of issue here within the Constitutional Convention was something called the 3/5 Compromise. All right, which I'm sure you guys discussed this last time we talked about the Constitution in middle school, right? Now, what this was, like I said, mainly over the issue of how slaves would be counted towards representation and ultimately taxation. All right, and so what we find here is that this is and compromises don't always lead to everybody getting what they want, but you can argue that the southern states kind of got a little bit of a better kind of deal on this. So what this basically states is that you will count slaves to the total population of free people, and the population of slaves will be 3/5 of that. To be simple here, all right, what essentially this is, for every 5 slaves, 3 of them will be counted towards population to be based on representation in the House of Representatives. Now, some people, there's a misconception here that this is basically that African Americans were considered 3/5 of a person. All right. That's not technically the case, but the idea is that 2 of every 5 of them are not counted as towards the issue of representation, right? And there's no question here; they're not considered. They're considered property for many people in the South. All right. Also, within the 3/5 Compromise was this idea that what the North got, what northern states or those who were kind of anti-slavery got, was the idea that there would be a halt on international slave trade for about 20 years, all right, and then it would be revisited. And so that didn't end the kind of slave trade. It just meant that the slave trade remained within the 13 states, all right. And then in the early 1800s, they basically kind of came back to it and said that's a complete total halt to the international slave trade. But the slave trade still existed. It just remained within the United States, all right. Now, there's an argument here. There's a lot of constitutional kind of scholars that believe that without this, we probably wouldn't have had the United States. All right, that this was an unfortunate kind of residual of this kind of dispute between northern and southern states. That most likely the southern states wouldn't have gone along with this if it wasn't for the 3/5 Compromise. All right, now there's going to be compromises continually kind of throughout history. All right, the one more famous one in 1820 is the Missouri Compromise. All right, which essentially allows Missouri to join the Union as a slave state, all right, and it'll basically create the state of Maine, which is taken out from part of which was controlled by Massachusetts, all right, to even the number. So there was a kind of we were always trying to put, in the Compromise 1850, where California was added as a state and stuff like that. There was always this kind of balance between slave and free state until it came to basically just a crescendo with the Civil War. All right. So this is a very controversial thing that comes out of the Constitutional Convention, which we are kind of still dealing with if you follow what's going on in the news today a little bit today. All right. So these are the 2 big things here, and the guys, the writers of the Constitution here felt that they had a kind of decent document here that was enabling us to move forward. Now, to make sure though, you got to leave here. You have to get the people on board with this. All right, and so you had to have it kind of go to the states. All right, the states had to ratify. Ratification just means approval. So the ratification of this is that 9 out of the 13 states, which was similar kind of to what we had in the the Articles of Confederation had to agree or approve of this new constitution before it could officially into effect. All right. So the state legislatures were the ones who were debating this. And there was a bit of a PR move, right? There was a number of people who were not necessarily on board with this, all right? So you do see kind of two camps that are like in favor of a stronger federal government to maintain this as a nation state. And you found others that felt that the states and individual rights were compromised maybe too much, all right? Were kind of sacrificed to a certain degree, all right? So what we start to see, like I said, kind of like two camps that start to emerge, all right? Sorry, I'm going backwards there. On one side, you have the Federalists. These were the ones who supported this new constitution. All right, we get the term federal because we're establishing a federal government, one that's basically kind of like sharing power between central national government and states. All right, so they kind of advocate for a push, like a PR here, kind of like a sales job, if you will, on this new one. And the most famous thing that kind of comes out of this is a collection, a series of articles that are compiled, referred to as the Federalist Papers. Now, the three main authors of this are James Madison, who's considered the father of the Constitution, right? Because his notes, basically, we get to know what happened down there. Alexander Hamilton, the famous one from the play Hamilton, and John Jay, all right? And so what these guys are going to do is basically kind of write all these essays, which are a little heady at times, to basically say this is why the Constitution should be ratified, all right? So I'm going to play this short little video here that kind of talks about the Federalist Papers, all right? It's only like 3 minutes. The main focus is on James Madison, all right? Because the most famous paper, if you will, they're numbered as Federalist Paper number 10.
In the years since the American Revolution, the United States faced a challenge very different than the one it had faced while fighting the British Army. Now, its leaders had to figure out how they would govern their newly independent nation. A young statesman from Virginia named James Madison rose to the challenge, not only as a vocal supporter of a written constitution, but also as a contributor to the Federalist Papers, one of the earliest expressions of American political theory. It happened during the meeting to draft the Constitution, later called the Constitutional Convention, that began in May of 1787 in the city of Philadelphia. While the delegates debated what should be included in this new Constitution, Madison was recruited by Alexander Hamilton and John Jay of New York to help promote its ratification. Together, they wrote the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 articles and essays. The Federalist Papers appeared in 3 newspapers and were written using the pen name Publius, a reference to the Roman Republic. Madison wrote roughly 1/3 of the 85 articles. In Federalist 10, Madison warned about factions or groups of citizens with interests that differ from the interests of the nation as a whole. Madison believed that a large republic is the best way to prevent factions. Voters in a large republic have a bigger pool of candidates to choose from, which increases the chance that a competent representative will be selected. To this day, Federalist 10 is considered one of the greatest pieces of American political writing. In Federalist 51, Madison laid out the framework for the system of checks and balances which allowed each of the 3 branches of the federal government to check the power of one another. In Federalist 54, Madison also addressed the issue of slavery in population surveys. It stated that slaves would be considered 3/5 of a person. This is the same idea behind the 3/5 compromise. While this sounds controversial today, it was critical at the time because it helped get the southern slave states to ratify the Constitution. As the Constitutional Convention continued, Madison also proved to be an influential and frequent participant, speaking over 200 times. Fellow Delegate William Pierce of Georgia wrote, "Every person seems to acknowledge his greatness. He blends together the profound politician with the scholar. He always comes forward the best informed man at any point in debate." After months of debate and deliberation, the delegates signed the Constitution on September 17, 1787, and then sent it on to the states for ratification. James Madison went on to serve as Secretary of State under President Thomas Jefferson and was the 4th President of the United States. But to this day, he is also remembered for his influence on American political theory in the Federalist Papers.
All right, so like I said, here's the kind of the cover of the kind of collection of essays here. All right, so it was basically it was a PR job, all right, to try to get people to support this. Now, not everybody's on board with this, all right, and so those who kind of oppose this new government or aspects of this new constitution were given the name by essentially the Federalists as anti-Federalists. It's kind of a negative kind of name, if you will. But these were people that, like Thomas Jefferson, all right, James Monroe, who becomes the 5th president of the United States, and Patrick Henry, all right, who was famously quoted saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," all the while owning slaves. The irony of that. But they felt that the new Constitution essentially basically didn't guarantee individual liberties and such. All right. And so what they advocated for, and which there was a compromise with this a little bit later, is they advocated for the Bill of Rights, right? Basically. And so the kind of debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, the compromise that we see here kind of outside here is the addition of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. An amendment is essentially just a kind of a change to something. When you amend something, you kind of add or change, if you will. All right. So, like, for example, Jefferson, when we talked about Shays' Rebellion, Jefferson was basically saying, sometimes rebellion is necessary in democracy, all right? Which some people maybe said, people who are maybe stronger Federalists said, maybe not so, all right? But their arguments essentially led to things like the First Amendment, where it's guaranteed, because their arguments saying there's nothing in here, as it's written, as it leaves Philadelphia, that guarantees people like the right to freedom of speech, or the right to bear arms, or the right to a fair trial and stuff like that. The Federalists were saying, but there's nothing in there that says that we're going to take that away. All right. So that was the argument, but there was a compromise. All right. So the kind of anti-Federalist kind of points of view do have a little bit of merit, and they have ultimately their kind of points are added into as the Bill of Rights into the Constitution. All right. So what we see here, like I said, we needed to have 9 of 13 states ratify the Constitution. The first state to do so was Delaware. And if you ever see anybody, you don't usually see, people in there around here with Delaware plates, but if you ever see like people with Delaware plates, I mean, they have it on their license plates, one being ratifying the first Constitution. And then the 9th state to ratify was New Hampshire, therefore having it go into effect, which officially goes into effect 1789. All right. So after that, then we're on course here to kind of basically talk about like next chapter, delve into the actual Constitution, not just the events that led up to it. All right. Okay. So that's about it. I'm going to stop here the recording for those of you guys at home. Adios.